Welcome to Scribbler to Scribe. I'm your host, David Scribbler Wishart, and I'm joined by my co-host, resident scribe, Pastor Ronnie Smith from Peace Lutheran Church. We invite you on a spiritual journey to explore questions of faith in the human experience. If you're searching for more meaning in your life, you're not alone. So join us as we search for wisdom and personal growth through a theological lens.
Today, the topic we've got on deck, which is your suggestion, which I think is a neat title. And I had experienced a day that maybe lends itself to this, but is that the idea that the cemetery is full of irreplaceable people. And so, when I hear this, we were coming up with this topic, just talking about different people who maybe think that whatever they're doing in life is so important, or get very hung up on whatever you've got on the go. And it turns out that, there's lots of people who thought about that about themselves at some point in their lives. But I want to, this title can come across as maybe a little despairing or nihilistic in some ways. So what do you, when you hear that, what does it mean to you?
I certainly don't despair. There's some humor in there, albeit it may be on the darker side. But it's also a reminder to me to continually check myself too, especially when you're a pastor. You got people trying to lift you up, put you on a pedestal all the time, and I have to constantly sort of reject that and try to keep myself low. But we've all succumbed to self-importance somewhere down the line. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I've resolved that issue. It's never going to happen to me again. But as far as the church goes, or any organization in particular, there's power consolidation that happens. People like to have control and influence over any given setting, and their own thinking sort of can sometimes lead us into thinking that we're irreplaceable, or everyone would be lost without me, or so they need me to have this control and this power. It's very seductive thinking. But it's really just an ego check, we may think we're irreplaceable in our area of expertise, but history shows that as soon as we move on, things continue, life continues. But that's really just sort of a bit of a humorous response to those situations, I guess. To remind, and I don't know if I've ever really said that to anybody in particular, but it's a good thing to just throw out there for people to think about, because we all get seduced by thoughts of self-importance, and it's just a way to cut those thoughts off at the knees. I'm not so special that the world won't continue without me, or I'm not so special that the church will collapse if I leave. But it also informs me in another way too, in terms of, if we're talking about leadership here. So pair that thought with another thought, which is leave the place in better shape than you found it. And what that typically means as far as ministry goes in a church context, you need to always be equipping and empowering leaders all around you in all the areas of the church or of the organization, if you're going there, if you want to apply it there. One more recent example, I guess, is that I'd been putting these music videos together for our worship services, and I really love doing it. It's a bit of a passion of mine. Mm-hmm. But I noticed that, I was like killing myself doing these things. First, you have to learn how to do it. And then you also have to try and do it, week after week after week without dropping the ball, have to deliver the goods every time. And I found like I was going deeper and deeper down a rabbit hole with that. Like, I got to get this done. It's got to be better than the last one. We got to do more all the time. And I got to be the one to do it because I want it done right and blah, 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 and all of those things. But I sort of noticed early on that it's going to be unsustainable if it's just me doing this. And that's why, it's important to empower the people around me, so that now our music director has taken on that role, and she's been doing a fantastic job with it, maybe even better than me. Like, her audio mixes are pretty clear. Mine can be muddy sometimes. But just, I recognize a need to sort of equip someone with the skills, and I trained them along the way, showed them what I was doing, and they took it and ran with it, and they've really done a great job. So believing in people too is another part of it. It's not enough to equip and empower if you don't believe in them. So it was costing me things like family time. Like, kids would be buzzing around like, oh no, I got to get this done. It's, my life depends on it, basically. And then eventually at some point I just have to check myself and say, you know what, Ronnie, the cemetery is full of irreplaceable people, and this is not working out. As much fun as you're having, as great as it is, you need support around you, and you can't do these things alone forever, because I was burning out, quite frankly.
Well, it's, you're describing basically exactly the situation that I alluded to at the beginning that I'm dealing with my own work. So similar kind of thing where you become the things that you hate in some ways, right? So one of the things that I really dislike in a work environment is being micromanaged. And, now I'm kind of hearing that I've become as a manager a bit of a micromanager, right? And it's comes out of a situation where we've had some organizational changes at work, and it's thrown me into kind of the deep end with some stuff. And so I've had to scramble and adjust to this sort of new reality that I'm in. And so in a situation where you feel like there's more uncertainty or whatever, you try to control it, right? And one of the ways that you control it is by doing everything, because you have fear over delegating work to others, because you trust your own work product, what you're capable of doing.
The whole if you want it done right, do it yourself mantra.
Yeah. And the problem being is that you don't have the capacity to do everything, and there's more work that needs to be done than what one person can possibly do.
Right.
Try to do that, you're going to pay for it in some way. You're either going to alienate the people that you work with or work for you. You're going to strip them of their sense of ownership and authority and autonomy over something, over a project, so they don't feel like they're sharing in it, and feel as engaged in that process. And frankly, what can happen is when you have the goal for yourself, is you can get yourself into this mind frame that the goal that matters to you matters to others in even close to the same magnitude. But most of the time they don't care at all, right? And not in a mean way, but just like everybody has like some of their own thing, and where truly powerful moments happen is when you all start pulling in the same direction towards the same goal.
Right.
So yeah, it's important to check yourself, to understand, and that's sort of where I learned about this today is I just had that dialogue with, people and said, like, we've been talking about these objectives and everything, but it isn't clear that we maybe don't share all those same ones. Like, it's not the same path that others envision their career going or whatever in life. And so, like you would with the music, is you see like an opportunity and you think it's important and you're doing great work and it's gotten good feedback and everything. But, when do you bring more people along that journey? I mean, it's always up to usually one person to have an idea to get things started.
Right.
But at some point, you have to kind of let go of trying to control that whole process. Right. The other night, we were going skiing. So I took my son to the ski hill, and he's 6.5, and he wants to do the hill like it's like a bunny hill, right? So it's like a fairly beginner's hill, and we're beginners ourselves skiing, but he wanted to do it himself, and he didn't want me following behind him and being right there. And as a parent, it kind of goes against every grain of my body to not be there to protect him, but you kind of just had to let him do it. And so he went all the way up the carpet lift there by himself, came all the way down, and I just stayed at the bottom, and I was like, I should go after him, I should follow him, and it's like, I gotta let this happen, and so I'm glad I did. But it's so easy to inflate this sense of your own importance in the world. And it can become very, like, at least arrogance, right? And vanity and a whole bunch of other things that I think just take you down a wrong path. And it's not that you shouldn't try to do great things, but you certainly have to just humble yourself at some point along the way and realize that, you got to give room for other people to do great things in those spaces as well.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's harder to do in your area, I guess. It's easier to do in the church, but creating a safe place where it's okay for people to make mistakes. Maybe at your level there's no room for mistakes, and it has to be 100% tight. So I don't know if this translates to you as much, but as you're equipping along the way, as you're empowering, and as you're sort of standing aside a little bit so they can flourish, at some point you have to allow them to spread their wings and fly. And they may not do it the way you want to do it, and they may make mistakes. But if you've created a nurturing and safe environment for that to happen, I think in the long run, you're going to get the results. So the person who's trying is feeling like, they're taking some initiative, they're feeling supported. They feel like it's a safe place to not get it right, perhaps. And if we're thinking like over time, I think you end up with a much stronger person on your team, I guess, than if you're constantly watching over their shoulder, putting this negative pressure on them, and they're feeling dispirited and demoralized. You're not really going to get much out of them. You may get an okay job, but you're never going to get somebody's A game in that situation. And so that's the hard part. And especially if you're responsible for them, in a corporate environment like yours is, I don't want to pretend to appreciate how hard that is for someone like yourself. But if there's any way, I really think that they've done you a favor by telling you that. And it takes a lot of guts for people to say those types of things. And so you kind of have to, reward that on some level, and let them know that thank you for sharing that. I appreciate the guts it took to say that. I want you to know this is a safe place for you to do that. And I welcome that. and watch people light up when you tell them things like that, and watch their motivation go through the charts when they dare to take a risk and they're rewarded for it somehow. And they didn't have the whole thing come crashing down on their heads.
And I think that to give people that space, it does take some confidence to do that. So it may not be as easy for everybody to, like, as Dave McGinley said, like, a bad day for your ego is a good day for your spirit, right? And so in order to have a bad day for your ego, you have to allow yourself to be open to those situations to happen. And in order to do that, you actually have to have a lot of confidence to just say, you know what, if somebody has feedback, criticism for how I'm doing something, if you're just open to hearing it, then you'll grow, right? If you try to get defensive, well, then there's no growth that happens through that.
Right. And also, what kind of relationship are you trying to build with, person X or whomever this is? One of the hardest things to do, I guess, in leadership role is to lead in vulnerability. Have the strength to be vulnerable, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a dog eat dog world out there, and a lot of people try to rule through fear and control and anxiety and power and all these things, but to lead through vulnerability is probably the hardest way. But I do think it bears the most fruit in the end.
Yeah, so I'm definitely navigating that as a relatively new manager of people, because in the past it's been more of like a individual kind of problem solver. So you try to solve all the world's problems, or at least the ones that come across your desk, kind of thing.
Now we can do that here.
Yeah, exactly. But you can't take all of that on, right? It's not sustainable, but it's also maybe a little bit arrogant to think that you can. And you don't realize that you're being arrogant in that situation. But you have maybe an inflated sense of self to do that. And it does take a certain amount of courage and trust to delegate things to others. So you have to just you can't expect people to be like instantly good at doing this, right? Flip that switch. And, it comes from being open to hearing feedback, but, to just switch into that other gear, because we're kind of honed to be these, the best people are the ones who solve the world's, problems, and, you can take anything to them and they're dependable, they'll get done, right? Stuff. But, I don't know if those people are necessarily the ones who are the most fulfilled and happy in their jobs. Right. They're probably stressed and overworked and feel exhausted. And there's others who know how to set better boundaries in different ways, not just by saying no, but just by understanding what their limitations are and knowing what they can and their team and what they can and can't do, right? Being able to stretch themselves, but not, overtax themselves. So it's definitely something that I'm learning. I have to just get to this point of appreciating that we're not irreplaceable. I'm not irreplaceable.
Yeah, you just replace somebody else.
Yeah, exactly, right. So, but okay, so here's a question for you on this theme.
Can we, before you ask a new question, let me just say one last thing there. So in ministry, you'll hear it when you're going through seminary and all that, getting trained up for this stuff. One thing you'll hear a lot is non-anxious presence. So if the organization is an organism, how you are as a leader spreads throughout the organism. And if you're an anxious presence, that anxiety spreads to the other people. But if you're a non-anxious presence, you can put a stop to a lot of the anxiety in the organization. So if you as a manager are coming in with an anxious presence to your team, well, guess what? You've got an anxious team now, no matter what, no matter how hard you work. So maybe one of the very most important things you need to master now, I guess, in this new role is, how do I be the non-anxious presence on the team?
Yeah. It's a very good point. Reflect on that, or digest that statement a bit. I think it's a good one. And one of the things that maybe I struggle with is recognizing when that's happening. Like where are these moments where maybe I am creating that anxious environment in the world around me, and we might not appreciate that some sentence that we say or certain choice of words or whatever it might be is creating that kind of an environment. And others may just say, you know what, I don't need to send that email. I'm going to leave it to that person who is also on it to resolve that situation. And if it doesn't get resolved in the time frame that I would have resolved it, well, is that a problem? And two, well, if it is a problem, if these people want to grow, they have to own the problem, right? Like, I guess, by extension, then I own the problem maybe, or something. And I think that's what I'm trying to control, is like, how do I keep these things from happening? But all you do is it's like whack-a-mole. Like, you just create another problem for yourself by doing that, right? So you have to, like, you just have to let it, I think you just have to let it be. And it's just, it goes against the core of like my being to do that, but
not even necessarily let it be, but you can be proactive in other ways. Like, get to know these people. If you don't know who they are, you don't know what's important to them, you don't know what their style is, you don't know how they function, you may be asking them to be a square peg in a round hole. Whereas maybe if you reorient the chess pieces, I guess, if you will, in that scenario, you may be able to find the right hole for everyone in that regard. So it might seem counterintuitive, right? Because deadlines, things got to get done, but chop, chop, chop. Yeah. Got a lot of pressure coming from the other end too, the other direction too. But at least starting that work up front is very important. Get to know who these people are, what their values are, what's important to them, why they're in the position, and solicit their feedback on a regular basis too. Like, and put some of your stuff on them. Like, here's problem Z. What do you guys think we should do with this, or something like that? Just to get to know how people think, I think would be a big help. And then you're not asking them to do things that I don't want to say that they can't do, but is not, you just have a better appreciation and understanding for what you're asking. And I think you're able to communicate with them so that they know what you're asking, if you've taken the time to have the relationship in there.
Yeah. So, on this topic, and we should turn it to scripture now. Like, in the Bible, what are some good examples of things that Jesus has said, around people who've maybe had an inflated sense of importance, in the world?
Sure. Funny enough, just last week, great example. So it's in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. I think it was 31 to 38. I'm not one of those guys who has every verse memorized. It was fresh, so that's why I know. Don't mean to be all like that. But that was the reading from Sunday, just yesterday, I guess. So not such a feat to remember it. But so he basically tells the disciples, like, look, this is what the Son of Man is here to do. Like, I'm going to get rejected by the chief priests and the scribes. Everyone's going to hate me, and eventually I'm going to get killed. And then 3 days I'm going to rise again. And Peter takes him aside and rebukes him, saying, like, we can't have this. No way. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you're our leader, you're our hero, you're our guy. Like, what do you mean you're going to get killed? And so then Jesus turns to all the disciples and he's like, get behind me, Satan. You've got your mind on earthly things when they should be on heavenly things, or human things instead of divine things. So Jesus basically tells them, yes, I've come, and yes, all these great things have been happening, but it's going to be a dark ending here. This is what my fate is. And Peter, he's kind of seduced by the thought that, they've got this movement, there's all this excitement, he's a key role in it. He's got a different vision of what this kingdom of God coming near is all about, this good news.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus very firmly corrects him in front of the group, because Peter was sort of thinking, well, this is not good for me and the things that I have planned, the way I see this going. They figure Jesus is supposed to like overthrow the Romans and overthrow the religious elite and usher in a brand new era where he's the leader and they're his deputies and everything's great. And now Jesus is telling them that it's going to be an absolutely terrible time. He then proceeds to say, anyone who want to be my followers, deny yourself, pick up your cross and follow me. So Peter was getting big ideas in his head and that were fueled in part, at least, by self-importance and his role in this movement. But Jesus says, no, that's not how this thing works. So he upends their expectations. Another example, sort of from a couple of weeks ago, where Jesus is baptized and then the Spirit drives him into the wilderness, which is really interesting. And there's a few different references to that in some of the different Gospels. Mark's is fairly simple, but in another one, Jesus is tempted by Satan, which is really, our own ego, our own internal struggle with who we are, and this whole self-importance piece, among other things. But the temptation is like, if you're the Son of God, or however it goes, throw yourself down from the temple and see if God will save you and the angels will save you. And Jesus is basically, you don't want to tempt God like that.
Talking about the scripture aspects of it, I think are valuable, just because, I think the situations that Jesus finds himself in, like, it's really interesting that, Peter has this big plan. And it's like, well, is that God's plan? And when you talked about that, the first thing I thought of was, okay, well, let's try to relate that to sort of day-to-day life. And say, okay, well, we have plans for ourselves, and I have my plans and you have your plans, and we have all these things and goals and everything we want to do. But how do we move beyond that and remove ourselves from those sort of sometimes it's bad to have personal objectives, but just somehow get more, recenter ourselves on sort of, I guess, God's plan. And then, you could make an argument, and it's like, well, this is going to sound funny to say this, but why is God's plan more important than my plan? Or something like, or is that whole, even that word, that plan, even the wrong word to use? Like, how do we just reorient ourselves away from getting stuck on some of these ideas, and where should we be sort of pointing, repointing our compass, so to speak?
Right. Well, the first thing I think of is, what's the motivation? What's our motivation, my motivation? What's your motivation? Anything you're trying to do in this world. And none of this is meant to be like, don't be ambitious, don't dream big, don't strive to be awesome, because of course we want you to do all of those things. But check yourself along the way, like, why are you doing it? Are you doing this for your own glory, or are you doing this to lift up other people in some way? Or are you doing it to be, a conduit of the Spirit in the world? And that's an everyday look in the mirror kind of thing. And most of us can't be bothered, I guess, to do that work. Like that's gritty spiritual work.
Mm-hmm.
And the world is designed to motivate us in the opposite way, which is, get more for yourself at whatever cost. Doesn't matter, as long as you're getting ahead, then everything is justified. I've been really thinking a lot lately how since the Enlightenment, the age of sort of materialism and consumerism, individuality, all of these things, it's really meant, in a lot of ways, it's trying to separate, our body from our spirit in some kind of way, or to deny our spirit somehow and satisfy these these bodily desires and lusts and things like that. So there's really two strong forces there. But you look around the world, like the model is consume, get more, consume, get more. How much can I accumulate? And the people who have nothing be damned kind of thing. And, I'm not saying you're like this because you're a very generous guy, I find. But in the banking world, I'm sure you see a lot of that narcissism, I guess. Like there are people driven by their own success, and that's the only benchmark for them.
Maybe I to be honest, like from my experience, and maybe it's the types of roles that I've been in the banking world, but it isn't really like that. Maybe it's a Canadian banking thing. You hear stories about other parts of the industry and you're like, oh my God, that's ruthless.
Right. Yeah, we're pretty well regulated here in Canada. I guess we're the envy of the banking community around the world in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so there's a certain culture there that's different. Is a little less dog eat dog. It's, it's like any organization has its political dynamics and stuff like that happens, but tend to be very consensus oriented company. And through consensus means that you need to, talk and discuss and collaborate and share ideas and come to, a shared decision. This means that you don't do things as fast as you would if it's sort of, a bunch of cowboys thing, right?
Right.
So it isn't, I'd say it's not quite like some of the ways that these things, they're characterized in different settings or in movies and stuff like that. Right. I know that there's definitely organizations out there. It feels like I can't speak for say like the tech space or some of the more emerging industries and what kind of cultures they've developed in them versus say a more entrenched or older industry and what's there. But it seems like some of the dynamics and attitudes are changing from away from kind of these hierarchical, authoritarian decision-making type structures,
right?
To embracing the kind of diversity and inclusion concept, to meaning that all the different voices can be heard. Now, the execution on that could probably be better because the strongest dominant voices in the room can kind of crowd out a lot of others. So
Right. Yeah.
you can have meetings that are a little bit of like theater, where it's you do it for the sake of saying you had a meeting, but a lot of it is like one or two people doing all the talking, and there's a dozen people in the room.
Right.
Um,
And I didn't mean to sound like it doesn't happen at the church either, because it happens big time in the church too. And so especially a lot of pastors, they get this I don't know what it is. They tend to glorify themselves in whatever's happening, and that seems to be maintaining that seems to be the biggest priority in a lot of cases.
mhm.
But I'm glad to hear you don't see that as much as maybe the public probably perceives. But certainly, in the corporate world at large, there's this sort of incentive to sort of accumulate, I guess, on some level, and outdo. I'm a very competitive guy. You pick a sport or a game, I'm in. Let's go for it, and I'll give it my everything. But like the stock market and things like that, like the wild speculation on people's futures and things like that we see. But absolutely, those things definitely happen in the church too. And that's why a lot of people are fed up with the church in a lot of situations. That's one of the reasons. And so none of this was meant to be that the church is separate from the world, because those things happen here too. And we have to have an honest conversation about that. And I just hope that there's still enough time to have that conversation to try to turn this thing around.
Well, you brought up the idea of competition, right? And I think that in the corporate world, the business world, or whatever, like competition, I think is a healthy force for driving people to improve, and so like a healthy
Innovation, yeah.
it gets people like from becoming complacent, right? Because things are always kind of moving, and so I think that I like it from the perspective of fighting against complacency, because complacency leads to rot and corruption and a lot of things like that, and competition sort of drives that out naturally. It sort of evolves forward, but that can it has a dirty underbelly, I guess, too, where people take that too far, right? And where it moves away from being like sport. There's no good sportsmanship anymore,
Right.
You're competing in a sport, and you're going out to win the game, but you're just playing your best. It's very different than going out and trying to injure your opponents so that they can't continue to compete, right? And
Right.
when it turns into that ugly territory, it stops being productive and starts being counterproductive, right? It starts moving in the wrong direction, and it becomes about winners and losers rather than sort of helping rise the overall tide. And that's where a lot of the maybe capitalism or whatever gets a bad rap, because it's just people turn it in that direction and lose sight of some of the fundamental goods that it can
Yeah, I'm still waiting for the invisible hand to be allowed to do what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so even in that conversation of cemeteries full of irreplaceable people, like it's very easy for me to go down a road where I'm starting to get on my high horse a little bit, and I could, if we went and looked back at that, probably see that's true. So it's just something, always got to check yourself before you wreck yourself, kind of thing, to put it in popular terms.
Well, if you're willing to check in regularly, you're rarely going to get too far off course, right? I try to keep myself from getting too adrift, and too arrogant. Like I probably, like, I can see that risk in myself of just thinking that I'm the smartest person in the room, and then getting that bloated ego about it, and just then not participating in things that I should and be like an active listener, but instead just being like, it just gets you all in this wrong space. And I sometimes am better about pulling away from that attitude. And there's other times where I'm just like, I get in my mind that nobody knows anything, and it's like, why can't they just figure this out? Why am I always the one who's got to figure all this stuff out? And everybody's always coming to me to, whatever. And you just get, and then it gets you like, well, maybe I haven't given them the tools to do that. I've never given them the freedom or space to feel like they have any confidence of making decisions, because I've always just controlled the whole thing.
Right.
And, if you want to see change in the world, you got to be that change, and you have to figure out like, well, okay, maybe I'm cultivating an environment that causes this to happen. And, but because other people aren't, doing what you want them to do or whatever, you keep trying to control the situation because they haven't shown that, they're getting it on that right track or whatever. So you just get in these weird, like, negative spirals, and you have to really like just pull yourself apart, get the 50,000-foot view of like, what the hell am I doing? Right. And, but I think just being willing to do that is a big step, right? Being able to just say that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've noticed yourself. That's the first step, of course. But there's also a self-interest side of this too. It's not wholly altruistic, I guess. It is to your benefit to have strong people around you. Your work gets a lot easier. Your team's performance looks better. All of those kinds of things, and that saves you a lot of stress in the end. So you said you were recently elevated to a next level, and so the people coming up after you, they haven't had maybe the experience that you've had. They haven't learned the things that you've learned, but you're expecting it from them on some level. Like, why can't they do it the way I would do it? And they just haven't had the runway, I guess, to get there yet, like you've had, I guess, maybe in some cases. And I remember a really cool leadership example, and this was a long time ago, but it stuck with me my whole life. There's a difference between fault and responsibility. Like, and anywhere you go, there's always like, oh, well, wasn't my fault, it was their fault, or whose fault is this? But that's different from taking responsibility over the situation. I was 20 years old, I guess, so this is a lifetime ago. And I moved out to Vancouver to work at this fine dining restaurant, and with my brother and his friend who were there. They invited me out. So it was really a great chance to spread the wings and all that. And I worked there for a few months through the summer, basically. And there was one day, so there was me, there was like a manager, and then the general manager. And I had booked a day off to go hiking in the mountains with my roommate, which we did. But then the next manager up disputed that, saying, no, he was supposed to work. So it looked like I missed the shift. And so I then, when I went back the next time I had ended up talking to the general manager about it, trying to, state my case. Like, I booked this off, like it wasn't my fault or something like that. Right. But then he was like, he didn't have time for that really. So he's like, you know what? It's my responsibility. I'll take the blame for it because I'm the general manager. Everything here is ultimately down to me. And that just shut me up. That shut up the whole dispute of whose fault it was, because he took responsibility in the end. And that really stuck with me. Like, even to this day, I'm using it as an example now. James, wherever you are, man, thank you. It was a great lesson in leadership, rather than trying to get out of something or point the finger. It's like, we're just going to own this and move on. So yeah, I guess you're in a position now where whose fault it is doesn't matter, because you're responsible for the team. essentially.
Yeah, I think once you start use that word of fault, like you've gone down the wrong road. Like you're just already way off the right track.
And this happens with your kids. It happens with people at church. It happens at
Mhm.
school. It happens any workplace.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to, I mean, I think that in everything in life, and it has case in the business world, but just to move up requires you to take ownership and accountability, take responsibility for things, good and bad. And that just, it's once people start to demonstrate that behavior, I think that their careers do really well, because people just see them as being, well, they'll take ownership of it. And when they're willing to take ownership of it, they become more dependable. And I know that they'll fix, if something goes wrong, they'll fix it because they've taken ownership over that. And if you work in an environment where everybody is acting in that way, I mean, you have a great support network. Whereas it's like a culture of fear. If it's all just whose fault is it, and you're never willing to take any risks because you're just at the whims of somebody accusing you of XYZ. But if you have a culture of accountability, then you can, right? You know that you're going to have the support of others around you.
Right. And if you set that tone, others have to fall in line with that, because the other way, it gets exposed pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, the cemetery is full of irreplaceable people. So, I think that that's a good mantra to just keep ourselves, that ego in check. And so I think that's a good spot for us to wrap up. So thanks for your time. And
thank you. Your time is just as valuable as mine.
Yeah. So we can.
We hope you found your time nourishing and life-giving. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. If you would like to hear more and support the podcast and Peace Lutheran Church, please consider donating at the link in the description. For DW, I'm Pastor Ronnie Smith. Peace be with you.